Okay, as I was saying, this is about communication. It's first interesting to note that there are many sounds in the world that we say do not have meaning. For example, a tree falling or a glass shattering. Philosophers may differentiate non-meaningful sounds from meaningful sounds in this way. Sounds as natural phenomena. Thunder is a discharge of electricity in the atmosphere. That is what brought it about. Seen this way, thunder is a causal product of physical causes and accordingly has no meaning. It is not part of any language. In this case, thunder is not a communication by anyone to anyone. In another view, sounds, language, as meaningful phenomena. Meaningful sounds are often said to be about what is in the mind, about thought. That is, words are not physically connected to any object in the world. For example, words are not in some way touching or pointing to trees. And in this view, thought does not cause the sound. Instead, sound is willed from thought. According to Noam Chomsky, for example, thought appears in another form as sounds. And the human mind learns the transformational rules that are required to transform thought into sounds and vice versa. Chomsky's mission is to discover those transformational rules. Language as an amalgam. Looking carefully, the Noam Chomsky vision is actually an empiricist one. Language can be seen from this view as an amalgam consisting of two parts, A, the dead part, the sound, and B, the living part, that idea, concept, or thing in the mind. The following can be said about these two parts, all ultimately pointing to the same conclusion. The dead part is ultimately about the living part. The living part is what gives the dead part its meaning. The dead part, the sounds, have derivative meaning. Their meaning is extrinsic to it. The dead part, the sounds, refer to the thing in the mind that is purported to have intrinsic meaning. Thus, the living part is what gives the dead part its meaning. Note the similarities between Noam Chomsky's and the empiricist vision. For the empiricist, simple elements must be considered structured and not merely a listing of simple concepts because, for example, the cat is on the mat does not mean the same thing as the mat is on the cat. All the meanings are the same for each individual concept. Thus, the difference must be in the arrangement of them, hence Chomsky's transformational rules. There are many variations on this theme that have occurred through history, for example, the free will issue, the soul-body relationship, etc. But the problem is that ultimately, these are all versions that lead to a paradox of self-reference. That is, the living part, whether it be God, the will, soul, or the thing in the mind, requires itself an explanation of exactly the same kind, or it must necessarily intrinsically contain that which it attempts to explain. The problem of intrinsic meaning will be discussed further in the next part of this paper, the problems of picture theory. Okay, the problems of a picture theory view of language and meaning. Number one, like empiricists, picture theorists draw on deceptively simple examples. The classic example, the cat is on the mat, is a very misleading example, and as it is quite easy to think of this sentence in spatial terms, which conveniently lends itself to the idea that a thought is a picture. But how would one apply picture theory to the same example that I gave earlier? He became less introverted after receiving all her caring and affection. One might assert some sort of picture or scenario that would seem to fulfill the meaning of this sentence. However, this would be but one example of a picture or scenario to represent he became less introverted after receiving all her caring and affection. This is exactly the same problem discussed earlier, that is, the problem of the abstract particular. Number two, pictures cannot convey their own meaning. The problem of intrinsically unambiguous structures. This problem is referred to in number 1 above. However, I will restate the problem for clarity. The problem of intrinsically unambiguous structures is apparent in the empiricist model of language communication. The idea is this, quote, I have a mental image representation, quote, in my brain that I encode and which the other person decodes to get the mental image. But the question is this, what makes the representation, the one that it is? The only way this view will work is if the picture or structure is intrinsically unambiguous, or else we would have random multiplicity of interpretations and a very strange, nonsensical world, analogous, if not identical, to the world in which the empiricist would theoretically live in when one is unable to define sets of necessary and sufficient criteria. But the internal structure is ambiguous, and this is clearly evident if one simply removes the words from the communication model, an unnecessary complication to the point of this argument. Suppose person A draws the image in his mind on a card and says to person B, "This is what I am trying to say." Of course, person B can interpret the image on the card an infinite number of ways. There is no argument about that. The image on the card is clearly ambiguous, so when the image is a mental thing, it is also capable of multiple interpretations, even on the part of the person who has it. There is no reason to think that the property of an image can change except by magic. All right, conclusion to part 1. I have shown in part 1 that one of the most readily accepted theories of language cannot possibly be right, as it entails, among other things, the notion of intrinsically unambiguous structures. To review, the basic idea is that words derive their meaning from structures in the mind, which on this view must be intrinsically unambiguous. For if the thing in the mind were said to gain its meaning from elsewhere, then one could say, and where does that get its meaning? The beginning of an infinite regress. I've shown in several ways, however, that the concept of an intrinsically unambiguous structure, that is, an entity which has its meaning contained within itself, is in fact nonsensical. Therefore, any theory of language, or any theory for that matter, that involves this notion is itself nonsense. Okay, part 2, an alternative. Where then does meaning exist? The problems that I have discussed previously indicate that it is impossible for meaning to exist in a static entity or at a point instant in time. The alternative is to simply realize how we acquire meaning all the time. In order to understand what another person says or means, we do not merely examine the person's state within a point instant in time. Instead, we look around or understand the context of the situation in order to gain meaning. I will now provide several examples to illustrate this point. Number 1. President Clinton says, "There is only one president." The meaning of the sentence can only be understood in the context of the situation. As I am writing this, most of those who hear Clinton know that he is the newly elected president, and therefore know that he does not mean in the United States we only have one president, as opposed to, say, some other place in the world that may have two or more. We know via the context of the situation that what Clinton means is that even though he has just been elected into office, he won't interfere with President Bush while Bush finishes his term. It's pretty indicative here because I wrote this quite some time ago, as you can tell. It shows about context. The point is to realize that there can be no determinate set of meanings behind or within the statement, "There is only one president," just as there cannot be any determinate set of meanings for any word or statement. We can only understand the meaning of a remark via its use. Notice that I cannot precisely define the range of meanings for a particular phrase or word, but that does not mean that I cannot understand the person's action, or what is being said. Number 2. The following statement is another example of how we draw on context to gain meaning. Look at this statement, "Enough is enough." It is certainly obvious that this phrase can be used in a number of different ways or senses. That is, the phrase "enough is enough" can impart different meanings depending on the context of the situation. Understanding this remark, or any remark for that matter, must involve the use of the phrase, looking around the phrase, and therefore meaning cannot be a function of a static structured entity in the mind. I'll continue this on another video.